Muchas gracias. Es siempre difícil de hablar en frente o al lado de una persona que fui su profesor. Pero él fue mi profesor, pero él fue siempre mi amigo, le puedo decir, porque en los años 70 un profesor era también el amigo de sus estudiantes. Pero,
no como ahora, recordar.
Pero ahora todo se acabó. Pero entonces es un placer para mí de ser aquí con vosotros y con Manuel. Voy a hablar de la violencia. Y para hablar de la violencia hay que... ¿Funciona bien? Sí.
No, funciona bien. Let me see one second, because there are people here who their knowledge of Spanish is limited, and you speak very good English.
You would like me to speak in English?
And,
is it? ¿Cómo quiere?
The official language of the institute is in English. Is someone here who does not understand English at all?
My English is with a very strong French accent.
Problem is that there are more people who don't understand Spanish, and so if you don't mind, we are going to switch to English, because these are the three languages. Catalan certainly not. So if you speak slowly in English, no Catalan here, then several people would not connect at all. And the language of the institute is in English. So why you don't switch to English?
So excuse me.
In any case, his text is in French.
My text, yo le puedo dejar, voy a dejar mi texto a ustedes.
Speak slowly.
So I will pass from Spanish. I prepare myself in Spanish. So what I would like to speak about is about violence, not only in historical or concrete terms, but also in analytical terms. Violence has changed during the last 50 years. But not only violence, maybe also our perceptions, our representations of violence. Let me give you, just to start, a very few examples. 50 years ago, we were living in the Cold War, which means that local political violence could not always develop, because if a local violence developed, then it would become a war, an atomic war, a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Another case, another example, violence towards women or towards children, of course, existed, but not in the public space, or in a very limited way. They were within the family, within institutions, within the school, within the Catholic Church, as we all know today. But it was not in the public arena. Then a certain number of social movements appeared, and movements where the idea of victim became more and more important. The notion of victim today is quite obvious. And many people say they don't like this notion, we should not speak too much about victims. But 50 years ago, the notion of victim was not so important in the public debate. And you have many victims that appear as individual or as group. For instance, people say, I want my genocide to be recognized. I want slavery to be recognized. I want slaughters of people to be recognized, and so on, which means a big change if we compare with 50 years ago. And of course, but I should not say that sitting next to Manuel Castells, the existence of modern communication means changed a lot. The reality and the perception or the knowledge of violence, and maybe violence itself. The forms of war, for instance, is changing a lot due to, at least partially, due to these new technologies. There are many examples that could give. I could say that differently. I could say it is difficult to give an objective definition of violence, but it is difficult to admit that violence is a pure subjective phenomenon. And here problems start. You will always find people that try to propose an objective, universal definition of violence. For instance, people will say something like, it's a very frequent definition. Violence happens when one or several people are threatening and transforming the physical or the moral integrity of one or several other persons. This is this kind of definition, which seems very objective. But we all know that in the real life, everybody will not give exactly the same importance to some different phenomena. And that there is, for everybody, a kind of hierarchization of what we call violence. And what I call violence, maybe you will not call it violence. When from a society to another society, the notion of what is violent and what is not violent will change. Within a society, at an historical moment or another historical moment, the definition, the perception, the representation of violence will change. Let just me give you a very small example to be clear. In my country, France, when peasants are very violent, from my point of view, they break cars, they burn the official buildings and so on, people say, oh, peasants are very serious people. If they do this, they know what they do, and it's not violence, it's protest. But if other people do the same kind or less important violence, people say, oh, that's unacceptable, this is a terrible violence. So people change their mind. What I would like also to say that is two things. First of all, for intellectuals, the idea of violence has changed a lot during the last 30 or 40 years. I remember in the 70s, in the early 70s, people such as important as Jean-Paul Sartre or Michel Foucault explaining that violence sometimes is necessary. I remember Jean-Paul Sartre explaining to the so-called Maoist revolutionary actors in France, explaining them, you should be more violent. No, I don't know any intellectual of that kind today that would speak like that. And Michel Foucault could be also another example. And the second and last word in my introduction, not very last, but is about mass media. It's very important to understand that if violence is subjective, the subjectivity has a lot to do with what mass media do when they talk about violence. They propose to put violence, or a so-called violence, on the first page or at the bottom of the last page. They propose a hierarchy in violence. They speak or they don't speak. They give the name of the actors or they don't give the names of the actors. They propose their categories to define what is violence. They propose the vocabulary to deal with what we could call violence. So you cannot try to understand what is violence today without taking into account the fact that most of what we call violence has something to do with what media does with many social phenomena. And last word for my introduction. We can distinguish between violence coming from bottom and violence coming from the state. Violence coming from social, cultural, political, religious actors, individual or collective ones, and violence coming from the top of the society and from the state. I will not deal today with the violence coming from the state. I cannot deal with everything. I just want to say one word. As you all know, I'm sure, in the classical sociology and in the classical political philosophy, people like to quote Max Weber and his famous sentence, which is not a theory, it's just a sentence. It's 1 or 2 pages in a big conference about the state monopoly of violence. It's not a theory, but people like to say, oh yes, that's it. The state has a monopoly of legitimation or legitimate violence. Okay. I think it is very important to think that today the state is not always exerting this monopoly and is giving this monopoly to private actors. There is a privatization of the state monopoly of violence. If you go to any commercial center or if you visit some buildings, you will see private guards paid by private companies doing the job the job of the police. Where is the monopoly of the state in these situations, for example? So, starting from this general introduction, I would like to propose to you two main ideas. The first one is that we must take seriously into account what classical social science propose in order to analyze violence. This will be my first point. But, and it will be my second point, this is not enough to understand some aspects within violence. And I will propose you some new ideas to deal with violence, which are not the classical ideas. But I think I must, first of all, say a few words about the classical ways of analyzing for violence. I will distinguish into three main kinds of approach for violence. The first one is the more spontaneous one. Violence, will say many people, including social scientists, violence is to be explained by the situation in which actors will become violent, and to be more precise, by the crisis in which some actors will become violent. And here there are two important words that immediately appear: frustration and aggression. The classical idea here is that in a situation of a crisis, there will be a lot of frustration, and this frustration will be transformed into aggression, that is to say, violence. This is a very classical way to analyze violence: political violence, crisis of the state, crisis of institutions, crisis of the political system. It will be also a way to say that economic crisis should or could lead to violence, but it could be also a way to analyze violence in a couple of people. He's beating his wife because there is a crisis in the couple, these kind of things. So this idea of frustrations becoming aggression is a very frequent one, and maybe the origin, one origin of this idea in the social science can be found in Tocqueville. That is to say, it's a very noble idea. If you read, I say it in French, L'Ancien Régime et la Révolution, the old regime and the revolution, there are very important pages where Tocqueville explains that the situation where people were the more violent during the revolution were not the situation dominated by, were situation dominated by changes, but positive changes. That is to say, not people becoming more and more in a situation of being poor, but situation where economic changes was positive, and these changes create a crisis because it creates a lot of frustration, and people, because people saw that there was changes, but they did not participate. They did not get something from these changes. So it's a very classical idea, and for those who have a more precise interest in this kind of ideas, the big man, from my point of view, in this field is an American political scientist who was very influential in the 60s and the 70s, whose name is Ted Robert Gurr. You can read his big books. It's more complex than what the little I say, of course, but it is this idea: frustration, problems of crisis, frustration, aggression. These kind of ideas are very important. For me, this is not a very useful way to analyze violence, but it can be sometimes useful. A second way of approach to analyze violence, I could say, is the very contrary of this idea of frustration and aggression. The very contrary, that is to say, the people who are violent are not answering to a situation. No, they are developing a strategy. They are calculating. Violence in this second family of analysis is instrumental. It's connected with interest. People know what they do. They are not frustrated. They know what they want, and they use violence as a resource. This idea is very frequent to understand, was very frequent to understand individual behaviors, but what is very important is that in the 60s and in the 70s, and I'm happy that Mario Dani is here, it was developed by Charles Tilly and many other historians, sociologists, political scientists, in order to analyze collective violence, collective behaviors, and not only individual behavior. And it was very important and very interesting. It means that violence is a resource which can be used by collective actors in order to achieve certain goals. If you read Charles Tilly and others, it is clear also that the main goals are political. That is to say, violence is a resource which is used by a collective actor in order to get in a political system or in order not to be expelled out of a political system. And Tilly is very famous for his study about the working class movement during more than a century in France, and demonstrating that workers were more violent where they had the feeling that they were far from the political system, and when they were in, or when they are in the political system, they are not so violent, to say it very briefly. This is a very useful way of approach. Let me give you an example. You have many people that study riots, urban riots. And many people say, oh, well, urban riots, it's frustration, crisis, aggression. So people that use this idea of instrumental violence will say, no, no, it's not chaos like that. If you look very carefully, you will see that some aspects, at least, of this violence are very precise and connected with a strategy, with a way to, a calculus. For instance, people will destroy some shops, but not all the shops in the neighborhood. They will destroy, for instance, the shops that belong to Korean merchants and not to black merchants. This kind of thing. It means that people know what they do and that there is some rationality in the way they use this special resource. So, it's a very important way of approach. Let me just say right now, because I will develop this idea within a few minutes, that the problem is that this kind of approach considers that violence is a resource like other resources, like networks, like friends, like money, social capital, whatever. It's a resource not so different from other resources. And this is a very important limit, because I consider that as soon as violence, and I will demonstrate it, or I could demonstrate it, as soon as violence appears, things change. I mean, violence transforms things, transforms the situation, transforms the meaning of action, perverts the meaning of action, and leads actors towards directions that he or she would not follow if there was not a violent dimension in action. I will be more precise within a few minutes. But I would just like to say a few words about the third sociological way of approach, or the third family of analysis for violence, which consists in articulating violence and culture. There are many, many different ways to articulate violence and culture. Let's just me give you one or two examples. The first one is the very, very famous theory of Norbert Elias about civilization, explaining that the more we are entering into civilization, the less violence has a space, unless it is instrumental, he says. So it's a very famous theory. I'm sure most of you have read the famous book by Elias, when he explains, for instance, that at the cour in France, the people were very civilized, obliged to control their aggressivity and not to be violent. It's this idea of civilization or culture being connected with less violence. Another example, which is different, is a very famous study by Theodor Adorno when he was in America during the Second World War and just after, when he wrote this very famous piece with other people about the authoritarian personality. Education, family will prepare your personality to be or not to be authoritarian. And if a culture makes authoritarian personalities, then these personalities will not be democratic and will be more open to violence, or at least will accept more some kinds of violence. For Adorno, the problem was anti-Semitism and was Nazi violence. So I don't develop. You have many other ways to connect violence and culture and personality. For me, the main problem is that it is difficult to explain violence today by something which is very far, by culture 20, 30, 40, 50 years before. You have been educated in a family, in some kind of school and so on. Of course, it may help to understand some aspects, but it does not explain why people will murder, will kill, will accept mass murders and so on.
Like ones do, others don't.
Yes, exactly. So it's interesting. I don't say forget it, but it's not very, it's not so useful. And this is why some people are going at the very extreme position, criticizing explicitly or not this kind of approach, just to say, no, if you want to understand violence, you must study interactions, local interactions, at the very moment when violence arises. And for instance, I say that because it's a very good book. Randall Collins, the last book by Randall Collins, or one of his last books, is exactly this idea. If you want to understand violence, don't go in culture, in the past, in personality. No, just study interactions at the moment when violence will arise. So, of course, all these three families of approaches that I just quoted very, very quickly are interesting. I don't tell you forget them. I say, just they are useful. You can try to see if they are useful to understand better such or such moment, such or such kind of violence, such or such historical experience. But they don't answer to all the questions that are connected with violence. And I will tell you what are the questions that I wanted to deal with when I started to try to think about violence more theoretically. Why, in some situations, in some cases, why do actors produce a discourse, and sometimes a very strange discourse? I studied Italian terrorism in the 70s and the early 80s. The more these people were committing awful violence, the more they were producing a discourse that was less and less understandable. At the very beginning, if you had some Marxist or revolutionary culture, you could understand and maybe share some aspects or some of what this discourse say. At the very end of this historical process, nobody could understand the discourse unless you were a member of the small sectarian groups that were practiced. So what is the relationship between discourses that are crazy and violence? Why religion is developing in some experiences when actors in the past were not religious and they become more and more violent and more religious. For instance, I studied in the 70s a movement in the South Lebanon. I did not study it very closely, but I read a lot and I went there. This movement was Shiite, so it was made with people with a religion, but this movement was not a religious movement. It was called, I don't know the English word, le mouvement des déshérités. The poor people, let us say. Something like that.
Not an English word.
Well, so this movement was a movement, and they were saying it was a social movement. It was a social movement in a population which was Shiite. Today, the same movement is called Hezbollah, and it's a very religious movement. So there is something, and today this movement is much more violent than 40 or 50 years ago. And there is another question, which is maybe for me the more difficult one. What do we do when violence gives the image of being connected only with itself? When violence is violence per se, is violence for violence. How do you understand cruelty? How do you understand sadism? This kind of question. Of course, when you deal with war, with political violence, maybe this is not so important. But in many cases, cruelty, sadism, violence for violence will appear. How do you explain this? What does a social scientist will say? What will a social science will say? So starting from these questions, I started to develop another way of thinking, and I did not find the very good words to name what I'm going to propose now. This is why my vocabulary is not so good, but it did not exist before, at least when, in the literature that I've been reading. And in order to understand what I'm going to tell you, I must now stop 1 second to introduce a very general notion which is not only connected with violence. So let me just stop 5 minutes in order to say a few words about this very important concept, not only notion, concept of subject. In the 60s, 70s, maybe much more, early 80s, and then it finished. There were in the social science a strong domination of structuralism and the idea that the subject should be destroyed, that we should not think in terms of subjectivity.
The notion of subject.
Huh?
The notion should be destroyed.
The notion of subject should be destroyed. We should think in terms of system, in terms of structures, and so on, and not in terms of subject. And subjectivity was not so. It was the core of what we can call structuralism. Then, in the mid-80s, we could say that the notion of subject reappeared and became more and more important. Something like a return to Sartre in the 50s. And in sociology, among the more important people that introduced this notion of subject, I will quote just one name because we are very close friends with him. It's the name of Alain Touraine, who published just in 1984-85 a book called, in French, Le Retour de l'acteur, the return of the actor. And some years after, I heard Touraine saying, I should have called my book The Return of the Subject. So this idea of subject...
No one noticed the difference anyway.
So I will say what is the difference between the subject and the actor. So what is the idea of the subject? It's the idea that every individual should be defined by his or her capacity to act, by his or her capacity to become an actor of his or her own life. This is the idea. And then you have a lot of proposals that come in the sociological arena to propose sociologies of the subject. And what is an actor? An actor is what comes when a subject is able to transform subjectivity into action. So it's not exactly the same notion. But this notion of subject is a very, or could be a very romantic, positive, wonderful notion that could not explain anything if you deal with violence. This actor, this subject that becomes an actor, that is able to build his or her own life, his or her own experience, it's wonderful. But what do you do when this person is destroying other people? How can you connect the idea of subject with this dark image of the actor? How do you do? So it is in order to work on this dark face of action, of these dark dimensions of action, that I try to propose a kind of typology which I will present very shortly. First point, I think that we can use this notion of subject to explain some cases where violence will happen due to the fact that it is not possible or it is very difficult for somebody or for a group to become an actor. There are some situations that make difficult or impossible the passing from the subject to the actor. I call this in my vocabulary the floating subject, the subject that floats because he or she cannot become an actor. Let me give you a concrete example. It's always too brief, it's just to make my ideas a little bit more precise. When you look at the urban riots in England in the 80s or in France in the 80s, 90s, and these years also, it is clear, and maybe in Catalonia today, there are some beginnings sometimes of urban violence. It is clear
No,
that...
that was television.
Oh, it's on the television, okay. So it is clear, at least in the French case, and in the English, that the young people that become violent, in France, for instance, they burned cars, 400 cars every night during 3 weeks in 2005. So these young people, what do they don't say anything, but what do their violence, what does it mean? I think that it means a kind of rage. These people say, we cannot be subjects of our existence. We cannot build our existence due to racism, due to the ghetto, due to social exclusion, due to discriminations, and so on. We can, and they are very violent because the official discourse coming from intellectuals and coming from political actors is something like, oh, young people, you should be integrated, you should be socialized. Come, if you don't participate in the normal life, it's because you don't want to be integrated. No, and they say, no, we are violent because we cannot be socialized, we cannot be integrated because a certain number of elements that make that for us we cannot become subjects. Or to be more precise, we cannot become actors. We want to become actors of our own life. We cannot. So this is a first very easy way to understand that there is a relationship between subjectivity and violence. Now let me speak of a second, a little bit more complex and interesting case. In some cases, this difficulty to become an actor means a feeling of losing meaning. I don't know if this is very clear, if my English is clear enough. That is to say, I cannot become an actor, I cannot give any meaning to my life, and I cannot be part of relationship that could be meaningful. So this means, so violence in the first case, which I described, means I am losing meaning and I become violent. But in some cases, this is the second case, people will create or adopt a new meaning for their life. They will say, okay, I cannot become an actor, this is meaningless, or there is no meaning in my life. I will give a new meaning to my life. And this new meaning will become a plethora, a lot of meaning that will invade my experience and that will be so strong that maybe it will lead me to some other forms of violence. What is this second case? What are the more important expressions of this second case? I think that it is connected with ideology or with religion. Religion is clear. I mean, if you listen to the Islamic discourse, it's full of words that are saying something like, we have now a meaning. Our life means something, and our death maybe will also mean something. So there is a lot, starting from the feeling that we are losing, that the life is meaningless, that we don't understand what happens, then you have a lot of meaning, so this makes a kind of, what I call in my vocabulary, hyper-subjectivity. You were losing everything, now with this new meaning, you are more than a subject. This is why I say hyper-subjectivity. Even if you don't follow me perfectly, just try to follow the way I introduce the issue. That is to be. So, let me give a more Spanish example. ETA. I don't know how you say in English. ETA? ETA. ETA. ETA?
ETA in America, ETA in England.
ETA. Okay, let us say ETA. It's very interesting. I have studied a lot ETA. I made a lot of fieldwork, and I knew very well the history. And I think that in ETA, there was a mixture of ideology and of a myth. That is to say, a discourse, ideology, that is more and more artificial, speaking in name of a nation, speaking in name of a working class movement, speaking in name of a political process, when people don't want to follow this discourse. And there is a dimension which is also mythical, because all these elements were supposed not to be contradictory. You could speak in the same movement in name of the nation, in name of the class, and in name of the revolution, all together. And I think that there is more and more violence when, on the one hand, ideology is more and more artificial. The nation does not understand, the real Basque people understand less and less what the discourse of the violent people. When the working class, when it exists, does not have anything to do with this violence, and when people are no longer revolutionary. So when each element is not connected with a strong reality, but much more with an ideology, it's more and more artificial, then there is more and more violence. And when it is more and more difficult to make all these elements go together, a myth is a discourse that proposes a conciliation, an imaginary conciliation of reality, which is contradictory. So when it is more and more impossible to articulate all these elements together in the discourse, there is more and more violence. So this would be my explanation in order to understand how État was not so violent when fighting against Franco, and the more you have democracy, the more the nation is strong in the Basque country and so on, and the less, and the more État is violent. It could have, it should have been the contrary. No. And this is because violence is connected with a myth and with some ideologies. So I think that we could try to introduce this kind of ideas, which means that there is a relationship between this this way of loading more and more with discourse, myth, ideology, religion, and so on, loading more and more your discourse with these elements and becoming more and more violent. So this is the second way we can deal with the notion of subject in order to understand violence. Now I would like to introduce a third issue. The third issue, I will first start with two examples. The first example, both are very famous. The first example is coming from Hannah Arendt writing about Eichmann. As you remember, maybe, or as you know, Eichmann, there was a big trial in Israel when Eichmann, which was a Nazi criminal, was brought from Argentina or Bolivia, I don't remember, Argentina, by the secret services from Israel, and there was a big trial, and it was a big moment, and Hannah Arendt wrote a very important book. It was, in fact, articles for a daily newspaper. So she wrote a very important book, and in this book she says, Eichmann is very interesting, she said something like, because he says that he is not responsible for his act. He says that if Hitler asked him to kill his father, he would have killed his father because he was in a situation to obey to a legitimate power. So when you are in a situation where, with a legitimate authority that asks you to do something, to be violent, you are not acting as a violent person. You are, in my vocabulary, a non-subject. You are not a subject. And so you should not be guilty, and you should not be condemned to anything. You just did what the power, the legitimate power, asked you to do. And my second example, which is very famous, comes from Stanley Milgram's experiences. I don't know if you remember these very famous experiences of social psychology when a legitimate authority, a professor, asks to students or to other people to send more and more electricity in the armchair of somebody who is giving false answers to some questions. It's an experience. So it is clear that some people, but not all the people, some people will obey to the professor that say you should send electricity in the armchair of this poor guy who is making mistakes. The real fact is that it is artificial. There is no electricity at all. It's an actor. It's a theater actor that is doing as if more and more electricity is coming. So the demonstration of in these very famous experiences is that when a professor, a legitimate authority, asks you to be violent, most of the people, or some people, will be more or less violent. But they are not subjects. They are just in a situation to obey. So this is the idea of being a non-subject. If you read a very, very good book by Christopher Browning, he's an historian that has written about the Second World War. He wrote a very, very good book about what he calls ordinary men, people that killed Jews in the eastern part of Europe, who just in terrible situation, just because they were obliged to obey. It's more complex, but this is the idea. So I don't want to develop this. I just want to tell you something about this third notion. The first notion was the floating subject. The second notion was the hyper subject. Here is the non-subject. I don't believe so much in the non-subject. We can discuss this idea. And in order to be more precise, there was a big Nazi leader whose name was Speer, who was close to Hitler at the end of the Second World War. He was an architect, and he was not condemned to death, but he was just condemned to 20 or 25 years in a jail. And when he finished with jail, he was interviewed by a journalist. And the journalist was Gita Seleni, was a very good journalist, asking him very precise questions. And he always said, well, I was innocent, I did not do anything, I did not know anything, I just obeyed to my Führer and so on. And at a moment, she's asking him questions that make him obliged to say that he knew that he was not so indifferent and so on, that he liked and so on. And he says, well, if the judges at Nuremberg were people like you, I would have been condemned to death. Because they would have obliged me to say the truth, that is, that I was not a non-subject, if I could say that like that. So it means that this is why I don't believe in this idea of people being non-responsible, non-subject. But this is not the more important for me. For me, the more important is what I call, because I did not find a better expression, the anti-subject. And here we arrive to something very important, maybe not historical. I mean, it is not maybe so heavy in the life, in historical life, in political, but it is the center of the problem of this issue of violence. I will start with some cases, some examples to be clear. The first one comes from an American literary critic whose name is Bill Beaufort. Bill Beaufort was in England in a railway station, and suddenly a train arrived full with hooligans coming back from a football game. And he was really astonished by these people, and he decided to follow them and to write a book about hooliganism. And it's a very good book because it describes people that go to in the city where there is a football match. These people don't go to the stadium, they have no interest in the football, they just go in the city in order to practice some violence with everybody that they will meet in the street. And what is very interesting is that these people, sometimes, not all of them, are middle-class people, and these people are very good bureaucrats in the ordinary life, or working in small companies. But they are ordinary people, but once a week or something, they violence for the pleasure of violence. Of course, this is the first example. A second example, maybe more interesting. Maybe you have read this famous Italian chemist, Primo Levi, who was sent to Auschwitz. He was a Jewish, but who came back. And he has written very important, among the best books about Auschwitz and all this, because he was there. And in his last book, his very last book, there is a chapter, a wonderful chapter, where the question is, why do the SS in the camp, why do they practice so much cruelty? It was not necessary. Their job was, they could do their job without any cruelty. Why do they practice cruelty? And it is a very interesting question. And cruelty, sadism, these are very important phenomena because it means violence for violence. And in many situations, cruelty will appear at war. And it will appear when there is not a strong control from the generals, the staff, and so on, when people are frightened. I mean, there are some conditions that make cruelty possible. Maybe you remember in 2004, Abu Ghraib, and these people committing acts of cruelty that were absolutely not necessary. So if you read the literature about war, you will find many cases like that. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. So it is difficult to say that these people that are cruel are subjects. But it is difficult to say that there is no subjectivity in the pleasure. So how do we deal with this? I call this the anti-subject in order to say it is part of the subject, but it is the contrary of the subject. The idea of the subject, as I said when I begin, means it's positive. It's wonderful to be a subject. You build something. Here, the idea of anti-subject, you destroy. And there is a very extreme case, which is when you destroy somebody that accepts the destruction. It is the so-called masochism, when people accept your cruelty. But out of this extreme case, I think that the anti-subject is this possibility for a human being to destroy and not to build, to be an actor of destruction and not an actor of building social relations and so on. So this is for me the very core, if we want to understand violence, pure violence. What happens is that in many cases you don't have pure violence. You have instrumental violence, or you have... Exactly. And it is a paradox for a social scientist who is obliged to say that the core of the phenomena is very marginal if you look at the historical importance. Cruelty is not so important if you want to understand war today. But it is the core of the notion of violence. This is for me a paradox, but it's like that. Maybe we could introduce other cases, or other possibilities. I just wanted to introduce a way to approach and to discuss violence. And I just want to finish by saying that in the real life, violence is never pure, sociologically pure. You never have only this or that. There is no reason that violence corresponds just to one aspect of the different case possibilities that I have proposed. In many cases, violence is a mixture of culture, instrumentality, frustration, cruelty. I mean, it's a mixture, and maybe our role as social scientists is to decompose analytically violence. It is true also that the different forms or the different meanings of violence can change from a moment to another moment in the same experience. Things change. And this will be my conclusion. I think, and then I would like to discuss these ideas with you. I think that if we want to understand violence, we should not build a one-dimension theory. Maybe not try to build a theory. We must consider that we have a certain number of analytical tools, that we can use these analytical tools. We trying to be coherent, but we can use them as a light in order to understand better a phenomena or another phenomena. Sometimes one tool is better than another one. Sometimes the light is stronger with such or such a tool. But I did not propose a theory. This is what I wanted to. It is not a theory that I propose. It's a way of approach violence in its real historical dimensions. So this is what I wanted to do.